So what I want to talk about today comes from the book that we've been describing and is a mash, if you will, of two of the critical chapters. And I also think it helps to fill a gap in some of what we've been hearing. So I think people have kind of been hinting at some of these issues and sort of teeing me up, but we haven't really heard sort of where's the role of governance, where's the role of regulation, and how does that solve some of the critical problems that sort of are on the way toward creating this future that we've been describing. So to kind of give you a tee, here's not a platform. So back in the day, we used to talk about product platforms as opposed to sort of these more industry or network platforms. So here's the Keurig 2.0. It's a neat machine. You push a button and you get a fresh brewed hot cup of coffee exactly when you want it and in the flavor that you would like. And so there's this tremendous variety of choice. They made an interesting decision about the user base and the compatibility in the transition from version 1.0 of the system to version 2.0. And here was what the result was. Oops. Your old complements are no longer compatible with the next version of the system. You know, so clearly, we know what the game was. The idea was we'll simply obsolete the old and get you into the new, and furthermore, sort of reduce the ability of third parties to attach. And we've seen this game before in lots and lots of different settings. I used to work for GE Medical selling CAT scanner tubes, and we had a certain tying arrangements that were very profitable, but did, in fact, draw the scrutiny of antitrust authorities. That's ancient history, and I no longer work for them, so. What Keurig did, though, is instead of creating this more open ecosystem that could have kind of mediated different preferences and kind of explored new tastes and opened up new markets, was really to more try to close down and monetize and extract the maximum profit out of its narrow market as they had defined it. And we would argue that they violated three critical rules of good governance, not just for platforms, but sort of more broadly. One was creating consumer value. It's very difficult to sort of convince people to stay with your system if you're destroying consumer value as opposed to creating it. Two, don't use your power as sort of this center to change the rules of the game, especially when those changes are clearly in your favor. And three, don't take more than your perceived fair share of the wealth. And so if we think about platforms, they clearly create great value. People will participate in them to the extent that they think it's in sort of their self-interest, and also if they think that the system somehow is fair and that the system isn't overly sort of greedy, if you will. That can work in the near term, but it's not a great recipe for long-term success. And so that's kind of part one. And now I want to talk about part two, just to set up some other ideas around governance. So we've all heard about the kind of MySpace Facebook. And here it was back in kind of the 2005, 2006 setting. You know, MySpace had tremendous market share. Now, along came an entrant, Facebook, and we know exactly how that story ended. And in fact, here are sort of the crossing market shares. And we have some competing stories on why it ended up that way. So Rupert Murdoch would say, well, we totally screwed up MySpace in every possible way, primarily by forcing them to sort of maximize revenue just as quickly as possible. And I'll explain kind of what it was that was a consequence of that. So here's a consequence. You know, and here's a second one, rather. So this is a MySpace page that's almost impossible to recognize. So at one level, you know, it's great that you can do almost anything on the system, but it's not a coherent user experience anymore. I can't navigate it. It sort of became completely overrun in clutter and advertising, and sort of drove users away. So, you know, what does that add up to? Well, at one level, MySpace was both too open and too closed. As Marshall laid out earlier on the story around open innovation, it was too closed. As DeWolf said, they should have totally focused on 5 to 10 key features, opened up APIs, and had outside innovators build on top. That wasn't the choice that they made. They said, we can do it all internally. It's just that they didn't have the staff. They didn't have all the smartest people on planet Earth working for them. And the features were never best in class. And furthermore, the system simply did not scale in the sense that they had kind of a spaghetti integral architecture as opposed to a more scalable, robust modular architecture. The second part was it was too open to both advertising, and it became kind of a dark and scary corner of the internet that parents who objected to their teenagers viewing porn in the 90s and early 2000s sort of said, oh, the internet is a bad thing. And this particular system did not help in that perception. So both of these are kind of issues of governance and issues of rules making around platforms. And in effect, we can say those are failures that, had they thought a little bit more systematically, could have been avoided. So we've seen this movie before. Annabelle, if you're still here, and I know Michael had to leave, did an excellent study, primarily with Intel and the architecture labs, about sort of how do you think about being a platform leader and sort of fairly dividing the pie and giving people clear rules of the road so that they know where you're going and not changing the rules of the game in the middle. Well, what they would say, the platform leadership and some of those rules, I would call platform governance principles. Giving customers a say, maintaining open standards, protecting intellectual property, communicating roadmaps. And this last, the second to last one is interesting. It's okay to treat different parties differently. They bring different things to the table. What people want is to understand what does it take to qualify as one of those preferred partners. And if Frederick Bandelay is still in the room, he's in charge of the partner program for SAP. They've done a good job of kind of carefully thinking through, well, how do you transition from sort of a distant partner that can just access APIs to something that gets closer and closer to the core. But where everybody understands, again, what are the rules of the road, and then protecting and promoting the long-term health of the small players. You know, and Annabelle and Michael have both continued to do excellent work in this space, and so I just want to kind of highlight a couple of more recent works. So that's all well and good in one country, but one of the things that we've noticed with platforms, and Peter Evans at the Center for Global Enterprise has really been leading the effort in trying to get a comprehensive survey of platforms around the world, is that they're growing dramatically, and for some pretty good reasons. So on Peter's version of this slide, and thank you for sharing it with me, Airbnb has, I think, about 28,000 listings, and the last time I looked, it was 40,000. And you didn't make that slide that long ago. So there's just incredible growth in some of these systems that are moving across the world. Similarly, we learned just yesterday from our colleague from Nigeria that there's tremendous platform growth also happening in some of the places that people in the room might not be as familiar with. You know, so all across the African continent, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, there's just tremendous innovation a lot of it, interestingly enough, with back-end infrastructure coming out of Europe. So now I want to transition, and I think it's kind of good to talk a little bit about Africa, about why it is that governance is a thing that we would want to talk about and go through. So you can think about resource-poor countries that have taken explicit effort to set up strong governance, and Singapore, is kind of a poster child for that, if you will. They started with a relatively weak governance system 50, 60 years ago, and lots of corruption, and a relatively poor country. And then over the course of a couple of generations, ended up with a per capita GDP greater than that of the United States. And they didn't do it by doing what we do down in Louisiana, which is to poke holes in the ground, suck hydrocarbons out, and sell them on a commodity market. Instead, it was done primarily through education, through sort of building intellectual capital, and then selling those and financial services and being a trading hub. So that was sort of a different way of going after wealth creation. And you can kind of juxtapose that against resource-rich countries where the term, quote, the resource curse applies. And so time after time after time, we've seen all around the world where we have these wonderful discoveries of minerals, of energy, of metals, of rare metals. The problem with that way of sort of going after wealth creation is that it's too easy to capture by a small number of elites, and it tends not to diffuse out to the broader population. But again, that is a governance issue, because if there was stronger governance in place, then those countries' sort of natural wealth would be more broadly distributed. And in fact, this has been pretty well documented by actually a scholar of the Sloan School or Department of Economics, Daron, and I always blow the last name, Asameglu, and I'm sure somebody will help me with that. But the point is that governance matters at a national level, and governance matters down at a very local and firm level. So let's talk about just a few questions that you might ask around governance and platforms. So one, there's just this core issue: who gets to participate? How does the value get divided? And how does conflict get resolved? So these are sort of some fairly high-level ideas. I'll wait for the picture. Okay, so governance resolves at least 4 issues, and I'm sure if we had a whiteboard, and since I'm a professor, we do this sort of thing, we could generate more. But there's information asymmetry that can harm users, and we heard about that just earlier in the LegalZoom presentation. There are externalities that are both negative that can harm users. So for example, the excess advertising and pornography that showed up on MySpace drove the users away and sort of destroyed the value of that system. But there are also positive externalities, which again, we just heard about, that the platform needs to kind of think about and manage and internalize and make sure that that benefit gets shared. There is monopoly power, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment, and there's risk. So these are all things that the users, when they choose to affiliate with a system, have the potential to expose themselves. And we know this, right? We know that the data that Google is collecting, the data that Facebook is collecting, the data that LinkedIn is collecting, has the potential for some harm. And I'll give you an example. So simply, if I knew your likes on Facebook, I could do a very good job of predicting sort of your proclivity for drug use, your sort of political preferences, and a number of kind of other behavior patterns that might be of great interest to your insurer, but might put you at some considerable harm. And these are kind of data issues that the platforms are just at the beginning of really beginning to sort through and think systematically, well, how do we manage that? So just yesterday, we were fortunate enough to hear from Jean Tirole, who gave us a very nice presentation kind of on some of the governance and regulatory issues. So I conveniently captured one of his slides, where he talked about platform as regulator and some non-price instruments that can be used. So in order to deal with some of the issues of monopoly power, platform will often act as competition authority and manage that. The platform will, in fact, regulate prices. It acts as a licensing authority. Remember that I went back to the earlier issue of talking about the fair treatment of intellectual property. And finally, the platform has a great number of fine-grained tools for control, up to and including the bouncer's right of showing you the door. And I should say that if Andre is here, and there are a lot of lights, he and Kevin Boudreau have also done some great work in this area of governance of platforms, and I'd point you to their work as well. So now we can start thinking of platform as policymaker. So Brad Burnham in 2010 did an interesting post about the behavior of a number of large systems, And he said, well, what does the introduction of credit systems at Facebook say about its monetary policy? Well, that's interesting. What is Apple's foreign policy in promoting a private standard or enacting multilaterally to embrace one that's more international? What is Twitter's industrial policy? Does it invest in state-owned services or promote more decentralized development by others in its economy? And the specific point here was they were pointing to gaps in the functionality and making a decision of whether to vertically integrate and provide those, that's state-owned services, or to simply hope that the ecosystem would catch up and fill in those gaps. And then one from Marshall's and my own work is, what is SAP's intellectual property policy, and how do they fine-tune the duration of intellectual property protection in order to grow the ecosystem, sort of most quickly? And just to give you the punchline on that, they offer their ecosystem partners about 18 to 24 months of protection before they take the right to absorb the most critical features into the next round of the core platform. And that's a tension that they're managing. The one is, of course, you want to have your development community sort of strongly incentivized to produce for your system, but then the downside is if they end up sort of forking and having too much cobbling together of small pieces, then you're failing as the steward of the overall system, because now you're forcing the integration challenges down onto the user base. And so over time, that's not a good thing. And so the platform almost has a responsibility to do certain amount of absorption. But there is a tension there. And I think the punchline that Brad was making was he said a lot of the behavior of these systems, maybe even platform isn't quite the right word. He said maybe government is a word that starts to make a little bit more sense. And indeed, over time, I think it's an open question as to where the role of the platform ends and the role of the state begins, and where is that line moving. And so what's interesting, and we just learned this from our colleague Weiru Chen, who provided data for the Chinese platform survey, that Alibaba has an explicit separation of powers agreement for its own system. So they have an explicit executive branch, legislative branch, and a judicial branch in order to prevent conflict within its own system. So this is remarkable, that platforms that you would think, these are just technical systems, we're just enabling transactions, and we're trying to make some money. Well, yes, but because of the frequency of interaction with individuals, you ask the question sort of where should regulation happen? And as we know from the Federalist Papers, we've tried to put regulation the very closest to where decisions get made. And at some level, the fact that platforms are absorbing some of that, while the regulatory community may view that as objectionable, we may say, well, that might make some sense. But I think the jury's open, and as we heard just a little bit earlier, we're really just at the cusp of this. And one final point out of the China survey yesterday was that we learned that Alibaba and Taobao are mediating 99% of e-commerce, and therefore the government doesn't provide consumer price indices to the population. They subcontract that effort to Alibaba because they have the most accurate data. And actually in this country, we've also seen similar things where the Bureau of Labor Statistics has survey data that's nowhere near as good as what the major search platforms have. The problem is that the search platforms change what they're doing all the time, and they don't have a back history of 100 years to do time series analysis. So we're sort of stuck with this old and new amalgamation. But I think this is just a fascinating area, and one that, as scholars of this phenomenon, I think is an important one, because businesses are going to have to sort of grapple with this tension of where they're going to fall on the line of sort of internal governance and state function. But regulation is not going away. And golly, I knew that I was going to have to pay $1 here to Malcolm if I mentioned the word Uber. So here's the $1. So as you can see from this, Uber had an interesting regulatory strategy, which was to just let it rip. So enter, ask questions later, build a big user base, and then get that user base on your side in order to overcome kind of the regulatory capture that some of these older industries have enjoyed over time. That's been quite successful, as we know, but I was just in Paris a couple of weeks ago, and we've all seen the news. So there can be some downsides to that strategy of going as fast as possible. You do invite a certain degree of backlash. Okay, so what are some key regulatory concerns that the state is still going to want to go after? Well, certainly this issue of privacy and who owns the data. So again, drawing on what Jean Tirole said to us yesterday, is data is an asset in a lot of companies, and in bankruptcy proceedings, there have actually been cases where the data on individuals, very fine-grained data, is then auctioned off to the highest bidder as part of the fire sale for liquidating the assets of a corporation. Well, that might be troubling to those of us whose personal information is part of that fire sale for liquidation. We've heard a lot about the 1099 economy. This is, are you a contractor? Are you a full-time? If you work half-time for Lyft and half-time for Uber and, a third of a time for TaskRabbit, what does that make you? And how do we treat you sort of in the social security system, particularly in countries like France, where independent contractors are actually taxed at a different rate than full-time employees? And so that's part of what's going on in terms of the conflict over there around Uber. And then finally, abuse of dominance. And we've seen this with the competition authorities going after, for example, Google on search and saying, there might be some evidence. And Yelp has certainly been yelping loudly that they're getting displaced in search results. So there's some concern, and you would want somebody at least doing the tests and checking to see whether or not this is taking place. And then just a slide I added a little bit earlier today from our healthcare panel was sometimes you have an industry that is so fundamentally complex and so fragmented that you might need some regulation to force coordination. And so we're seeing this in the healthcare records space, where you're getting rulemaking coming out of the government authorities in order to ensure data portability, because the industry is a long way away from kind of settling on an open standard that enables a lot of the digital services that we're all still looking for. Okay, so there are some cautionary tales for regulators, lest they get sort of ahead of themselves. So again, coming out of the platform survey from across the globe, here are some of the unicorns, in fact, all of them. And these are startups with valuations of over $1 billion. And so if you're sitting in Asia, you're feeling pretty good about that. And if you're sitting in North America, you're like, yeah, but this is what we do. We innovate. We celebrate the entrepreneur. And that North America is actually Europe. And there's a considerable degree of European platform anxiety. And you're going to get asked questions when you go over there, especially in my role, sort of, well, what do you think? Is it our regulatory environment that is retarding the development of sort of these interesting and innovative new companies and organizations? And that's a wide open area, and the governments are already kind of funding efforts to get to the bottom of this, but it's an interesting issue. Okay, so some advice for regulators. Does the platform have a functioning governance system in place? If so, is it being used to reduce negative externalities that would harm the platform, such as criminal behavior by users, or just sort of goo like you got on MySpace? Or is it being used to reduce competition or take advantage of dominant market positions? The goal is to facilitate the right transactions. You want good transactions to occur. You want bad transactions not to occur. And if the platform has better information, the parties are both on platform, and the incentives are aligned, self-regulation is possible. On the other hand, if they're off platform, incentives are misaligned, harm is being done, then there may be sort of room for state regulation. And so I'll give, again, Jean the last word, since this has been an active area of research for him for nearly 30 years. And I'll just read the final line, which said, regulation should be adapted to suit specific conditions in each industry, and then I would add to that, in each country. Thank you. Vince.
I'd like to gently push back on a phrase you used. You said the role of the platform is to divvy up a fair share of the wealth between the platform and the complementers. I'm reminded of Mark Twain's words of, in theory, there's no difference between theory and reality, but in reality there is. So when you say fair share, can you, we all would agree with the concept, but how do you operationalize that?
Well, so saying that its job is to do that, I think it's in its strong self-interest to do that, because these are repeated interactions. And so again, I'll just go back to my Keurig example and say, look, when you change the rules of the game and that transfers quite a bit of money from my pocket into your pocket, I view that as an abuse of the system.
My question, though, goes to how do you get agreement and consensus about what's fair?
So the answer there is, and how much value did you contribute? So you've got a whole set of users. They're all adding value into the system, and you would like the divvy of the total to be at some rough level proportional to what people are contributing.
Okay. I don't expect you to have a rule for that. I just, as I said, wanted to give you a little friendly push. Thank you.
I actually have have a question concerning the governance.
Yes.
Several days ago, I read an article about an ad tech company. Actually, this company has changed its governance a little bit. It has the revenue sharing model,
Yes.
which fit quite well with the community. But later, they changed it to a little bit, giving this company a more share of the revenue share. And their claim is like, we are doing this for the long-term benefit of you all. And because we use this money to expand our user base, and you guys will eventually benefit from that. So how do you see conflict like that? They actually the set are very angry.
So I'm going to actually answer that because I don't have any idea the example. But one of the things that we've observed is that a lot of these systems, particularly in India and China, are sort of taking $1 of revenue at a cost of $2 or $3. And so that's clearly unsustainable, and it's true that they're building out, but they're only going to last as long as the venture capitalists who are willing to kind of fund that millions or billions of dollars of growth sort of have patience for that. So I think in those settings, you would actually expect to see rules of the road change. And I think the really critical thing there is a tremendous amount of communication so that you're not surprising the community as you make these changes over time. And so I think that's where companies get into a lot of trouble. And sort of Facebook is a textbook example of getting into trouble on the privacy regulations and sort of the reuse of data. And then they do something bold, and then they have to kind of reel back. So I'm kind of switching examples, but I think the basic idea of changing the rules is more about communication. And I can see that. Yep.
Just to follow up on that gentleman's question, and given your last slide there, do you have any brief thoughts on network neutrality and the idea of usage-based pricing for IP?
Brief thoughts. So in general, I'm pretty enthusiastic about open standards and infrastructure that we can all build on top of and use. And so I don't really want to get drawn into that debate because I think the camps have tended to polarize themselves. But in general, I think we've done very well for maintaining open access and open standards and have had a tremendous amount of economic growth as a result of that.
Thank you.